Sirens weren't the first thing I heard that morning, laughter was. My son stood ankle-deep at the edge of our lake, showing a pair of kids how to spot turtle tracks, when a stranger began shouting that he was trespassing. Phones came out, accusations flew, and before I could step in, she dialed the police with shaking hands. She said an illegal poacher was harassing wildlife. She had no idea she was calling the law on the state's wildlife warden chief. This lake has been in our family for generations, bordered by oaks older than the county itself. We open it to neighbors, anglers, and school groups because stewardship matters more than fences. My son learned that early. He studied conservation, wore the uniform with humility, and believed calm explanations solved most conflicts. That belief would be tested within minutes. The woman paced the shoreline, narrating a story for her camera. She pointed at my son's badgeless field vest and mocked his requests for space around a nesting area. When he explained regulations, she laughed and said, "I know my rights." The kids went quiet. The birds lifted. The water stayed still. I watched from the dock, choosing patience over escalation. Years of public service had taught my son the same lesson: don't argue with assumptions, document facts. He radioed his office, not for backup, but to log the encounter. He kept his hands visible. He smiled. That seemed to anger her more. When the patrol car arrived, the woman rushed forward, demanding arrests and fines. She recited half-remembered rules and insisted the lake was public. The officer listened, then turned to my son and asked for identification. My son nodded, reached slowly, and presented his credentials. The shift was immediate. The officer straightened. The radio crackled. The woman's voice faltered. "Ma'am," the officer said, "this is the wildlife warden chief for the district." Silence fell like a dropped net. What happened next unraveled more than a misunderstanding. It exposed how confidence without knowledge can harm people, wildlife, and communities in a single call. It tested restraint, authority, and accountability, and it would end with consequences no one on that shore expected. It began a chain of events involving citations reversed, apologies demanded, and lessons recorded in official logs. By evening, training emails were drafted, access rules clarified, and a community meeting scheduled. The kids returned to the water smiling, the turtles undisturbed, and my son reminded everyone that authority serves best when paired with respect, transparency, and restraint. What followed would redefine boundaries, reveal character, and prove why calm leadership matters most in conflict for everyone involved. The woman's certainty didn't disappear immediately, it cracked, then tried to rebuild itself louder. She insisted the officer was mistaken, that uniforms could be faked, that titles meant nothing without her approval. The officer listened patiently, then asked her to step back while he verified credentials through dispatch. His calm only sharpened the contrast between authority and assumption playing out on the shore. While the radio confirmed my son's position, he stayed exactly where he was, hands relaxed, voice even. He explained that the area was temporarily restricted due to nesting activity and that educating visitors was part of his job. He spoke the way he always did, with facts instead of force. The woman interrupted repeatedly, accusing him of intimidation and favoritism, claiming the children were being brainwashed by government propaganda. The officer raised a hand. "Ma'am," he said, "you called us to report a violation. Right now, there isn't one." Her face flushed. She shifted tactics, demanding to file a complaint instead. That request was granted, and the officer opened his notepad, asking for her statement. The moment it became official, her story began to unravel. Details changed. Timelines blurred. She contradicted herself about what she had seen and heard. Meanwhile, the children quietly told the officer how my son had shown them turtle tracks and explained why they needed to stay back from the reeds. Their calm, unprompted accounts carried more weight than her raised voice ever could. When dispatch confirmed my son's authority, the officer documented the call as unfounded. He also noted interference with wildlife education and disruption of a protected area. The woman scoffed until the officer explained that false reports can carry consequences. That word, consequences, finally landed. I stepped forward then, not to argue, but to introduce myself as the property owner. That revelation added another layer she hadn't anticipated. The lake wasn't public. Access was permitted, not guaranteed. Her certainty had been built on assumptions stacked so high they collapsed under simple verification. The officer explained next steps clearly. No arrests. No fines for my son. A warning issued to the caller for misuse of emergency services. An incident report forwarded for review. He encouraged everyone to take a breath. The water rippled softly, indifferent to human pride. As the patrol car pulled away, the woman stood alone, phone lowered, narrative broken. The kids returned to the dock. My son resumed the lesson, pointing out a nest just visible near the cattails. Calm returned, but the moment lingered. Because what happened wasn't just about one call. It was about how quickly fear becomes authority when unchecked, and how easily truth restores balance when documented and calm. The ripple effects would extend beyond that morning, shaping policy, conversation, and trust in ways none of us fully understood yet. By afternoon, the incident had already taken on a life of its own. Messages poured in from neighbors who had heard fragments of the story and filled gaps with speculation. Some thought arrests were made. Others believed the lake had been closed. A few insisted the woman had been mistreated. My son understood how these narratives form, and he moved quickly to ground them in facts before assumptions hardened. He filed a supplemental report clarifying the educational purpose of the visit, the protected nesting zone, and the sequence of events. He attached photographs of posted markers, time-stamps from his radio log, and statements from the children's parents. Documentation, he always said, is not about winning arguments, it is about preserving truth when memories shift. The report went up the chain, copied to training and community outreach. That evening, the woman submitted her complaint. It alleged harassment, misuse of authority, and threatening behavior. The language was dramatic but thin. When reviewed against the body cam footage and witness statements, it collapsed. Still, procedure mattered. A neutral supervisor contacted her, listened, and explained findings. Respectful process diffused what emotion could not. The next morning, my son received a call from the regional director. Not to scold, but to thank him for restraint. "This is how we want encounters handled," he said. "Education first, enforcement last." The director asked permission to use the incident as a training example, anonymized, focusing on de-escalation, public communication, and protecting wildlife without escalating conflict. My son agreed. Meanwhile, I hosted a brief community meeting at the dock. We clarified access rules, nesting seasons, and why certain areas require space. People asked questions. Kids asked better ones. We posted clear signage and shared a calendar of guided walks. Transparency replaced rumor. The woman did not attend. Instead, she emailed an apology, brief and careful. She acknowledged fear, not malice, and asked to move on. We accepted. Accountability does not require humiliation, it requires learning. The officer who responded sent a note as well, praising the calm shown on all sides once facts emerged. A week later, a new sign went up countywide at similar sites: "Education area, ask before you approach wildlife." Simple words, big impact. Calls dropped. Curiosity rose. Standing by the water that evening, my son reflected on how easily authority can be mistaken for aggression when fear leads. He also saw how quickly trust returns when leaders slow down and listen. The turtles nested. The kids returned. The lake remained what it had always been, a classroom. The call had started with outrage and ended with policy, proof that calm leadership can turn conflict into clarity when everyone chooses patience over pride. The following week brought an unexpected development that confirmed just how far that single phone call had traveled. A formal notice arrived requesting my son's presence at a county review session, not as a subject of investigation, but as a reference point. Several similar complaints had been logged recently at lakes, reserves, and wetlands across the district. This incident had become the clearest example of how fast misunderstandings could escalate when fear replaced facts. The session wasn't adversarial. It was analytical. Supervisors, wardens, and community liaisons sat around a long table reviewing timelines, footage, and transcripts. My son walked them through every decision he made that morning, explaining why he chose patience over authority and education over enforcement. He emphasized that wearing power lightly often protects it best. One supervisor paused the video at the moment the woman raised her phone and started narrating. "This," he said, "is where things usually go wrong." Everyone understood. Once a public narrative begins, truth has to work harder to catch up. The room agreed that better signage, clearer outreach, and faster verification tools were needed. By the end of the meeting, new protocols were drafted. Educational interactions would now be clearly marked. Dispatchers would ask clarifying questions before sending patrols to conservation sites. Officers would receive refresher training on wildlife authority structure, including identification cues for wardens in field gear. None of it was reactive punishment. It was proactive correction. Outside the room, my son received messages from fellow wardens thanking him. Many shared stories of similar calls that had ended poorly because tempers flared too fast. His restraint had given leadership a template to point to. Calm, clear, and documented. Back at the lake, life continued. School groups returned. Anglers asked questions instead of assuming. The water line felt lighter somehow, as if tension had drained away with the paperwork. Even neighbors who had supported the woman quietly admitted they hadn't known the rules either. Ignorance, once named, lost its edge. Then came one final moment of closure. The responding officer stopped by off-duty, not in uniform. He shook my son's hand and thanked him. "You made my job easier," he said. "That doesn't happen often." Respect passed without ceremony. That afternoon, my son watched the kids release a rehabilitated turtle back into the reeds. He reminded them that protecting wildlife isn't about control, but care. Authority exists to serve, not to intimidate. The lake reflected the sky, unchanged. But everyone who stood near it that day understood something new. Calm leadership doesn't just prevent conflict. It teaches communities how to respond when fear tries to take control. In the days that followed, the community's attention shifted from outrage to reflection, and that shift mattered. The county released a brief statement summarizing the incident without names, emphasizing education, access rules, and respectful reporting. It asked residents to pause before dialing emergency lines and to seek clarification first. The tone was calm, corrective, and firm, and it set expectations everyone could understand. My son returned to routine work, but routine felt different now. At trailheads and docks, people approached him with curiosity instead of suspicion. They asked why certain areas were roped off, how seasons affected wildlife, and what to do if they saw something concerning. He answered patiently, using the same explanations he always had, now amplified by trust earned under pressure. The woman who made the call became quieter in public spaces. Rumors swirled about consequences, but there were none beyond a formal warning and required education on proper reporting. That restraint was intentional. The goal was correction, not spectacle. She attended a county workshop weeks later, sat in the back, and listened. Learning, when it happens, rarely announces itself. At the lake, signage improved. Clear icons marked nesting zones. QR codes linked to simple guides. Volunteers rotated through weekends to answer questions. Calls dropped sharply. When concerns arose, they were specific and calm. Dispatch noticed the difference and shared the data internally, citing reduced response times elsewhere as a direct benefit. A local teacher asked my son to speak to her class about conservation and conflict. He told them the truth, that authority carries responsibility, and the best use of power is preventing harm before it starts. He explained that listening can be stronger than commanding, and that facts, when shared early, save everyone time and pride. I watched the students nod, not because they were told to, but because the story made sense. They understood that fear grows when information is missing, and that shouting rarely fills gaps accurately. They asked thoughtful questions about reporting, respect, and accountability. As summer settled in, the lake felt like itself again. Loons returned. Kids fished from the dock. Conversations replaced accusations. The incident faded from gossip into guidance. What remained was a standard, quietly raised. When someone reached for a phone, they now paused. When someone spoke with confidence, others asked for sources. Calm had become contagious, and that change protected more than feelings. It protected wildlife, trust, and the simple joy of shared space. This lesson endured, shaping how neighbors questioned assumptions, how officials trained responses, and how children learned stewardship, proving that calm explanation, verified facts, and patience can redirect fear into understanding, preserving shared places and dignity when conflicts threaten to escalate beyond reason for communities everywhere facing moments like these together today. By mid-season, the lake had become a quiet reference point for something larger than conservation. Officials from nearby districts began visiting, not to inspect the water, but to observe how a community rebuilt trust after conflict. They watched how questions were answered, how boundaries were explained, and how authority was carried without display. What they saw was simple and effective: calm presence, clear information, and consistency. My son didn't change his routine. He arrived early, walked the shoreline, checked markers, and greeted visitors. The difference was how people responded. Where suspicion once lingered, curiosity now led. Parents asked how to teach children respect for wildlife. Anglers asked about seasonal patterns instead of loopholes. Even skeptics softened when explanations were offered without judgment. A regional training memo circulated soon after, referencing the incident as a model for de-escalation. It outlined steps that seemed obvious in hindsight: slow the encounter, verify roles, invite questions, and document without dramatizing. The memo emphasized that authority grows stronger when it's transparent. My son's name wasn't attached, but his approach was clear between the lines. The woman who made the call returned one afternoon, quietly. She stayed at the edge, listening as my son explained nesting zones to a family. When the group dispersed, she approached and apologized in person. Not defensively. Not conditionally. Just plainly. She said fear had spoken for her that day, and she wished she had asked first. My son thanked her for saying so and invited her to join the next guided walk. She nodded and left. That moment mattered more than any memo. Data followed the change. Emergency calls from protected sites dropped across the county. Education requests increased. Volunteer sign UPS doubled. Dispatchers reported fewer confrontations and clearer information when calls did come in. Quiet progress rarely trends, but it lasts. At a small end-of-season gathering, the responding officer spoke briefly. He thanked the community for learning together and reminded everyone that reporting concerns is important, but so is accuracy. Ask first, he said. Verify second. Call when it's needed. The applause was soft and genuine. As dusk settled, turtles surfaced near the reeds, unbothered. Kids counted ripples. Parents chatted. The lake did what it always did: held space. Watching it, I realized something enduring had formed. Not a rule, but a habit. The habit of pausing before assuming, of listening before escalating. That habit protected more than wildlife. It protected dignity. When people carry authority lightly and curiosity openly, conflict loses oxygen. What began as a frightening call ended as a community standard. And standards, once set by example, tend to spread quietly, shaping responses long after the story itself fades from memory. As summer turned toward fall, the story stopped being retold as drama and started being remembered as a turning point. Not because someone was embarrassed or corrected, but because a community learned how easily fear can hijack judgment. That lesson settled quietly into everyday behavior, showing up in small pauses and better questions. At the lake, new routines formed naturally. Visitors read signs instead of ignoring them. Parents explained rules to children before being asked. Anglers checked seasonal guidelines on their phones. None of this was enforced with threats. It worked because people understood the why, not just the what. Education had replaced confrontation, and that shift proved powerful. My son noticed it most during guided walks. Questions became thoughtful. People asked about habitat balance, invasive species, and long-term conservation plans. They listened. He often thought back to that morning when his calm had been mistaken for weakness. Now, that same calm drew respect. Authority had never needed volume, only consistency. The county invited feedback from residents near protected sites. The responses were revealing. Many admitted they had once assumed officials were overreaching. Others confessed they had used emergency lines out of frustration rather than necessity. After the incident, they felt more confident seeking information first. Trust, once damaged, had begun to repair itself. One comment stood out. A parent wrote that watching the interaction taught her child something school hadn't, that being right doesn't require being loud, and being wrong doesn't require being shamed. That single sentence captured what policies often miss. People remember how they are treated long after they forget who was technically correct. The woman who made the call attended the next guided walk. She stayed close, asked questions, and helped keep kids back from the reeds. No one whispered. No one pointed. Learning had replaced labeling. When she thanked my son afterward, it wasn't dramatic. It was human. Elsewhere, similar approaches took root. Another lake adopted the same signage. A wetland reserve introduced volunteer educators. Dispatchers reported fewer repeat callers and more accurate reports. Small changes compounded. On a quiet evening, my son and I sat on the dock, watching the water turn silver. He said something that stayed with me. People don't want to be wrong, he said. They want to feel safe. If you give them information without taking dignity, they'll choose better next time. That truth explained everything. The call hadn't come from malice, but uncertainty. The response hadn't worked because of rank, but restraint. Authority had been revealed not as force, but as stewardship. The lake held the reflection of the sky, unchanged. What changed was how people approached it, and each other. A habit had formed, one that traveled quietly from person to person: pause, ask, verify. And that habit mattered more than any citation ever could. By the time winter approached, the incident had become part of institutional memory rather than local gossip. It showed up in training slides, orientation briefings, and quiet reminders passed between supervisors. Not as a warning, but as an example of how easily situations can escalate, and how deliberately they can be slowed down again. The lesson was no longer personal. It was procedural. My son was asked to help review new outreach materials. He suggested plain language, fewer legal terms, and more explanations about why rules exist. People protect what they understand, he said. That sentence made it into the final draft. Pamphlets changed. Websites simplified. Signs stopped sounding like threats and started sounding like invitations to learn. At the lake, the seasons did their work. The reeds browned. The water cooled. Wildlife adapted without caring about human schedules. Visitors still came, bundled and curious, asking about winter habitats and migration. Conversations stayed respectful. When misunderstandings happened, they ended with clarification, not confrontation. The habit held. One afternoon, a new family arrived, unfamiliar with the area. They stood too close to a protected zone, unsure of boundaries. Before my son could step in, another visitor gently redirected them and explained the markings. That moment mattered. Authority had diffused into community responsibility. Stewardship had become shared. The responding officer returned again, this time with a trainee. He pointed out the signage, the flow of visitors, and the calm interactions. This is what success looks like, he told her. Not silence, but understanding. Not absence of calls, but better ones. The trainee nodded, watching how questions were answered without tension. I realized then that the most lasting outcome wasn't policy or training. It was confidence, the good kind. People felt confident asking instead of accusing. Officials felt confident explaining instead of enforcing. Fear had lost its grip because information filled the gaps it once exploited. The woman who made the call faded into normal life. No labels followed her. No whispers trailed her steps. She became another person who learned something the hard way and then did better. That mattered. Communities heal when mistakes are allowed to end. As the year closed, the county released a brief report showing reduced conflict calls at conservation sites and increased participation in educational programs. Numbers confirmed what we already felt. Calm spreads. So does respect. Standing at the lake one last time before winter set in, I watched my son check the markers, steady and unremarkable in the best way. Leadership rarely announces itself. It shows up early, listens carefully, and leaves things better than it found them. The water reflected bare branches and pale sky. No sirens. No shouting. Just continuity. The lake remained a place of learning, not because rules were feared, but because understanding had taken root. One final chapter remained, not to relieve what happened, but to explain why it stayed. Looking back, it's clear the most important outcome of that day had nothing to do with titles, uniforms, or authority. It had everything to do with how people respond when fear shows up first. The call to police could have ended in humiliation, escalation, or lasting resentment. Instead, it became a moment that taught an entire community how easily power can be misunderstood, and how calmly it can be corrected. My son never raised his voice that morning. He never demanded respect. He didn't reveal who he was until asked. That restraint mattered more than his rank ever could. When authority is used to dominate, it creates resistance. When it's used to explain, it creates trust. That distinction shaped everything that followed. The lake returned to being what it always was, a shared responsibility rather than a contested space. Wildlife thrived. Visitors learned. Kids grew curious instead of cautious. Rules became guidance, not weapons. And when problems appeared, they were handled with conversation first, not confrontation. That shift didn't come from policy alone. It came from example. People still talk about the incident, but not with excitement or anger. They talk about it as a reminder. A reminder to ask before assuming. To verify before accusing. To pause before dialing a number that can change someone's life in minutes. That pause became the most powerful tool anyone gained from the experience. For the woman who made the call, the story didn't end in shame. It ended in understanding. She learned, adjusted, and moved forward. That mattered. Communities don't grow stronger by punishing mistakes endlessly. They grow stronger by allowing learning to replace fear. For the officers involved, the call reinforced why patience matters. For dispatchers, it reshaped how questions are asked. For educators, it became proof that knowledge prevents conflict better than enforcement ever could. And for the children who watched it unfold, it became a lesson they'll carry far longer than any classroom lecture. As for me, watching my son lead without force was the quietest kind of pride. He didn't win anything that day. He preserved something far more valuable: trust. Trust between officials and citizens. Trust between neighbors. Trust that truth, when handled calmly, eventually speaks for itself. The lake still reflects the sky the same way it always has. What changed was the awareness of the people standing beside it. They learned that authority is not about being right loudly, but about being responsible quietly. And that is why the story matters. Because sometimes, the strongest response to a false accusation isn't power. It's patience, clarity, and the courage to let truth do the talking.